Hello biology students, and welcome to video 1 of our new unit, the cell reproduction unit. And here we're going to be talking all about how cells make copies of themselves. So we're going to start out with this pretty hilarious cartoon over here. We can see I have DNA in two forms. I have it in this kind of messy form and this much more organized X form. And you can see the X form saying to the messy form of DNA, "Dude, mitosis starts in 5 minutes. I can't believe you're not condensed yet." So hopefully you'll understand why this is absolutely hilarious when we reach the end of the unit. So there are 5 main questions that we're going to be trying to answer during the first half of this unit. We're going to be looking at what reproduction is, why cells need to divide, how they divide, what controls their division, and how their division is related to tumors and cancer. So that's kind of the plan for the first half of the unit. So let's start with the first question, which is what is reproduction up top there? So we've already seen this a little bit. We're going to define reproduction as the process that creates a new cell or organism from a pre-existing one. So basically, we're going to have a cell, it's going to copy itself, and then we're going to have another cell. So this can happen two ways. It can result in an identical copy, or it can result in a similar copy. So we have 2 types of reproduction. Asexual is when reproduction results in an identical copy of the cell or organism. And sexual reproduction is when we result in a similar cell or organism type after we reproduce. So let's talk about asexual reproduction first. So in asexual reproduction, you only have a single parent. So you only have one parent. And because it's only one parent, the offspring end up being a clone of the parents. So the offspring, the children, are genetically identical to the parents. And in asexual reproduction, cells are going to divide using a process known as mitosis that we're going to be focusing on in the first half of this unit. So this is usually things like bacteria do asexual reproduction. So you can see down here I have a couple of pictures of a bacteria cell dividing into 2 to make 2 identical copies. So the other type of reproduction, the one we're more familiar with, is sexual reproduction. And this is where you get 2 parents. So you have one parent donating a sperm and one parent donating an egg. And those 2 cells combining and mixing their genetic material to produce a genetically distinct offspring. So the offspring does not look identical to either parent. And in sexual reproduction, in order to make that new offspring, both mitosis and what we call meiosis are going to be used. These are 2 different types of reproduction that we're going to explore over the course of this unit. So let's look now at the second question. So now we kind of have a basic idea of what reproduction is, but the second question is, why do cells need to divide? Like, what's the point? Why do they need to reproduce in the first place? So why do cells need to divide? So there's many reasons why cell division is necessary. We already know from the cell theory in the cell unit that cells can only come from other cells. So, if we're going to make new cells, cell division is absolutely essential if we're going to make new cells. So making new cells is important because, if we're unicellular, if we're a bacteria, we can only make new organisms if we divide via cellular division. So we can produce new unicellular organisms. Our cells have to divide to create new sperm and egg if we're going to do sexual reproduction. When you were first created, when your parents' egg and sperm combined to create you were only a single cell. So in order for you to develop into a multicellular organism, the single cell that was you had to divide many times. So cell division is required to create an adult organism. And also, every time you get an injury or cells get too old and have to be replaced, we have to use cell division to renew those cells and repair those cells. So we have several reasons why cell division is important. Okay, so let's look a little bit more at the first reason why cell division was important. So we said it was important because it can make new unicellular organisms. So it turns out that unicellular organisms, so things like bacteria that are only made of one cell, they use cell division to asexually reproduce. We've talked about this already. Now this process of when bacteria use asexual reproduction to reproduce, we call this binary fission. So that's a vocab word for you. So here I have a picture of binary fission. You can see this bacteria cell is literally dividing in two. It has made 2 copies of its DNA, and it's going to pinch off and make 2 identical cells. So I want you to, in a second, pause the video for a second and think about these 2 questions here. So think about what a prokaryotic cell is made of and what would have to happen during cell division to make a second cell. So pause the video and answer the question on your note outline. Okay, so let's move forward and see if you were right. So binary fission, we said, is this process by which a prokaryotic cell divides. Well, we know that a prokaryotic cell is basically has very, very few organelles, has some ribosomes, and we know it also has DNA, but it has no nucleus, and it has that cell membrane and sometimes a cell wall. So some of the answers to the questions on the previous slide could have been that we have to make another copy of the DNA, we have to make some extra ribosomes, and we have to pinch off the cell wall and the cell membrane. So let's look at binary fission. So the first thing that's going to happen is that bacteria have a single circular chromosome. So their DNA is in one big circle. So that DNA molecule has to replicate. I have to make 2 copies of it. And the 2 copies have to move apart. So you can see, here's my prokaryotic chromosome. So there's the DNA of the bacteria. We end up with 2 copies, and those 2 copies move to opposite ends of the cell. We also mentioned how the cell membrane has to get bigger and pinch off. So the next thing that's going to happen is the cell is going to elongate. It's going to get bigger. So you can see my cell elongating here. The membrane grows, and then the membrane pinches off, allowing the cell to divide. So that's the process of binary fission. That's how asexual reproduction in a bacteria works. So now, just to reiterate why cell division is important in multicellular organisms, we need it to grow and develop. So like I said, you start as a single cell when you were first created, but obviously you're made up of many, 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 many billions of cells now. So you have to undergo cellular division to become a bigger organism. And also to replace old and damaged cells. So the picture I have here to illustrate this is a starfish. Because starfish, if they get a limb cut off, they can actually regenerate that limb by undergoing cell division and growing it back. Okay, so here's a picture kind of showing out how, multicellular organisms start as a single cell when they're first created, and then we undergo mitosis, this cell division process, to eventually make a multicellular organism. And then we also undergo cellular division to repair, broken or dead skin cells, which is what this is showing here. Okay. So now let's do the same thing with eukaryotic cells. So think about how eukaryotic cells are different than prokaryotic. So pause the video and answer this question. What would be some things that would need to happen to a eukaryotic cell in order for it to divide? Okay, so let's move on and see if you were right. So hopefully, back at that question, you would have said that eukaryotic cells have to make copies of all their organelles, which is a much more complicated process than in a prokaryotic cell. Okay, so finally, the last essential question that we're going to address in this video is how do cells reproduce? So how do cells reproduce? So one of the more complicated things about eukaryotic cell division is that we, in our cells, we have a ton of DNA. We have way more genes than a prokaryotic does, and that makes sense because we're more complicated. So for example, in one human cell, there are 25,000 genes. That's how many scientists approximate that we have. Where in a bacteria cell, there are only about 3,000. So we have a lot more DNA to deal with and copy if we're going to divide our cells. To make things even more complicated, prokaryotes like bacteria only have one circular chromosome, but our genes are grouped into multiple chromosomes. Okay, so we have a lot of DNA to deal with. Okay, so before we divide our cells and make a new copy, we have to first make a copy of our DNA. So the first thing that has to happen in cell division is we have to duplicate our chromosomes. We have to make another copy of them. So let's look at what a chromosome is, because I keep using this word and we really haven't talked about it all that much. So DNA basically can come in 2 forms. It can come in a big stringy form, known as chromatin, and that's when the DNA is kind of like, not organized and it's a mess. And if you kind of look at this, If I tried to make a copy of this big mess and then, separate it, it would get very, very tangled. It might rip. That's going to be messy. So whenever the cell goes to make a copy of DNA and, separate the two copies, instead of having DNA be in this chromatin form, what it does is it puts DNA in chromosome form. So chromosome is when we take this very long, stringy DNA molecule and we wrap it around proteins called histones so that it's nice and compact. So you can see here, before cell division, but before we start moving around chromosomes, chromatin coils up into the compacted state known as chromosomes. Okay, so this is my chromatin. Before I move it around and separate my two copies in cell division, I'm going to take this and I'm going to very nicely coil it up. So see how I'm coiling it into this nice form here. And this nice organized form, that's what a chromosome looks like. Now chromosomes only happen when a cell is dividing because it only has to be in this nice organized form when I'm going to be moving the chromosomes around to the two separate new cells. Okay, so basically I have my nice chromosome here, and in a cell, in a human cell, we have many, many copies of chromosomes. In fact, we have 46 chromosomes. But before I make a new cell, I have to copy this, so I have one copy for each new cell. So what happens is this copy, I make a duplicate half. So this half is identical to this half. So that way when I form a new cell, one half could go to each new cell. So when we look at this here, this chromosome, it looks like an X, but each half we call a sister chromatid. And the two sister chromatids are identical. They're the two duplicate copies where one copy is going to go to one new cell and one copy is going to go to the other new cell. Okay? And then this little spot right here in the middle that holds the two sister chromatids together, that's called the centromere. So I have the two sister chromatids held together by the centromere, and the whole thing we call one chromosome. So if we look at this copying of DNA, so originally in your cell you're going to have one copy of each chromosome. Before cell division you're going to make a copy of that. So now you have two copies. We call the two copies sister chromatids. And then when I go to make my two new cells here, one sister chromatid goes to each new cell, and now I have one copy of the DNA in each new cell. So cell division separates these sister chromatids into two new cells, and each chromatid is now a new individual chromosome. Okay? And this allows each new cell to have a full copy of the DNA that we had before. So we're going to continue this thought in the next video. That's where I'm going to stop. So that's it for video 1, and I'll see you in video 2.